Welcome back to Let's Talk History. Today we have Hannah Exley. She's a third-year IR major at the University of British Columbia who wrote a paper on the 1953 coup in Iran. Hello, Hannah.
Hello, it's good to be here.
So, first I'm going to ask you what your overall impression was on this paper.
Yeah, well, this paper was a bit bittersweet for me because I love doing all the research and I read a lot of books for it. But by the time I came to write it, I had so many other things on my plate that I didn't really have time to put in the time that I wanted into the paper. So when I was handing it in, it felt good, but at the same time, I knew I could have put in another week and done it so much more thoroughly. So it kind of leaves a sour taste in my mouth, but at the same time, I learned a lot from it, and I think overall I presented that what I learned in the paper. So yeah.
I see. So, why did you choose the 1953 coup as your topic?
Well, last year I studied the United Fruit Company in Guatemala and the subsequent 1954 coup there in depth, and I was struck by the similarity between that situation where there was a big kind of foreign company exploiting the resources of a small country with not a whole lot of power, and then someone tried to nationalize it, or at least control part of it, and then there was a coup. So I was wondering what the similarities and differences were between Iran and Guatemala a year later, and as it turns out, there were some striking similarities in the CIA involvement. In fact, the coup in Iran kind of served as a blueprint for their later operations in Guatemala, for example.
That's really cool. So, let's dive a little bit further into the paper. What were the research questions?
Well, I started out with about 4 questions. So first of all, who were the major players in the coup? Because I didn't really know that earlier. I didn't have a good idea of the different factions in Iranian society before this paper. So who were the major players? And did the local players in Iran what was their impact compared to the external players, such as the CIA or the British, MI6? And then the next question was, did this operation by the CIA have more to do with the politics of oil or the profits from the oil company, or did it have to do with Cold War dynamics, Cold War politics, and the kind of the strategic control of the oil? And finally, what was kind of the precedent that this coup set? What was its impact on the world after these years, both in Iran leading up to the 1979 revolution and within the CIA and around the whole world?
That sounds very thorough. So, how did you go about answering these questions?
Well, read a lot of books. I have these books here, so I was kind of hoping to get as many perspectives as I could. So I found a good mix of books and articles and primary sources and I used as many primary sources as I could. And not all of them appeared in the paper, but they were really helpful in understanding what was going on. Yeah, that's where it came from.
Awesome. So, out of those sources, which did you find the most interesting?
I think I was most interested by the primary sources. So, for example, here I have the memoirs of Mohammad Mossadegh, which were really interesting. I didn't even know these existed, but I found them in the bowels of Kerner Library late one night. And it's really interesting to get his perspective on everything that happened. And I didn't really feature this prominently in the paper, but just for my own reading, it was really interesting. The second would be I found a bunch of declassified CIA documents in the National Security Archive, which I was reading through, and it was also really interesting to see their perspective and how blatant their conclusions were. They basically say, yes, we were responsible for the coup. And yeah, so those featured in my paper.
All right, and one last question for you. Were there any more topics that you would have liked to explore further on this paper?
Yeah, so it's not really directly about the coup, but I found the legal precedent that the nationalization of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company really interesting in 1951. because there was a subsequent court case between the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, backed by Great Britain, and the state of Iran. And I tried to track down this source. Apparently it exists in the law library. There's a book that has the actual court case in it, but I went there and I couldn't find it, which I was really disappointed about. But I did find a number of articles about the precedent that this set in international law and about nationalizing natural resources in developing countries, and the authority of states to come in and say that they were stealing from them. And that has interesting connections to the Suez Crisis, for example, as well as Guatemala and all kinds of other places. So this case set out the authority of states to say, no, these are our natural resources. Or that's what I read, but again, I couldn't find the actual case.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time.
Yes, thank you very much for having me.